Hello and welcome. In today's broadcast, I'm going to talk about a very important debate among historians that has been taking place over the last 10-20 years about the most important aspect of the most important military clash of modern history, that is, the Second World War. And specifically, this is a debate among historians about the origins and reasons behind the German attack against the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. What motivated it, why it took place, and the circumstances behind that attack. This is of particular interest, of course, in Germany and Russia, and has gotten much less attention here in the United States for a number of reasons which I'll go into. But it's first of all important to understand that in the fighting of World War II, by far the greatest amount of combat, by far the greatest destruction and killing in World War took place involving the forces of Germany and her allies on the one hand, and the forces of the Soviet Union, the Red Army, on the other, on the Eastern Front, not involving the forces of the United States. The portrayal of World War II, reinforced and propagated by American television and motion pictures and politicians and even comic books, presents and highlights the American role in World War II. Now, to some degree, of course, that's understandable, but the U.S. invasion of and landing at Normandy in June 1944 is given much greater prominence than it really deserves because the war had already been decisively decided on the Eastern Front by the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, that is less than a year before the end of the war in Europe altogether. But the American portrayal of World War II, above all, is meant to uphold a kind of mythology of World War II as a struggle between the good guys, good people, led above all by the United States, and bad guys, represented above all by Hitler and the Nazis. The fact that America's most important military ally in World War II was the Soviet Union is downplayed tremendously in the American rendering and portrayal of that conflict. And the debate among historians that has been taking place, but especially in Europe and in Russia over the last 20 years, has received very little attention here in the United States. And among the nations of the so-called advanced countries of the world, in that regard, Americans are certainly the most misinformed, misled, and miseducated people around the world. And especially here in the United States, the portrayal of modern history, and especially of World War II, is particularly simplistic and one-sided. The Nuremberg Tribunal of 1945-46 was set up by the Allies to demonstrate to the world the evil of the German defendants and of the Hitler government, even, you might say, the unique evil. But the issue of why Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941 nevertheless was unanimously answered by the major German defendants as a preventive war by Germany to forestall an imminent Soviet attack. That was the testimony of the most important and high-profile German defendant, Hermann Göring, at the Nuremberg Tribunal. It was also the testimony of Alfred Jodl, who was probably Hitler's most trusted military advisor and who served in World War II as Chief of Operations of the German Armed Forces High Command. And Wilhelm Keitel, who was Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, in effect a position equivalent in the United States of something like Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon or Secretary of Defense, also testified that Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union was made very reluctantly, and only after overwhelming evidence had come to the attention of the Germans that a Soviet attack was very, very close to being carried out. In the years after World War II, there were very few books published, and very few historians did anything other than accept or repeat the official Allied view about the German-Soviet clash during the Second World War. There were some books published in Germany, mostly by rather obscure writers, which criticized and took issue with the official U.S. Soviet version of World War II history. But all that was rather second and quiet until the late 1980s and the appearance of the book Icebreaker by the Russian writer Viktor Suvorov. Now, this book Icebreaker immediately caused tremendous amount of discussion in Europe. Editions were published in French and in German, and a Russian edition became widely available even in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The writer, Viktor Suvorov, is really a pen name. His real name is Vladimir Rezin, and he adopted a pen name because he had been a defector years earlier from the Soviet Union to Britain. He had been a high-ranking Soviet military intelligence officer and had already written about Soviet military intelligence. And that's why he adopted this pen name. But his books have continued to appear under the pen name of Viktor Suvorov, even though his real identity is well known, and he's appeared at conferences, and in fact presentations by him, even in English, are available on the internet. The book Icebreaker has been published in English in Britain, but not in the United States. But recently, in 2008, a detailed book that summarizes and incorporates writing by Viktor Suvorov from Icebreaker and other books he has written was published by the U.S. Naval Institute Press under the title The Chief Culprit. In other words, this revisionist book about the World War II was published in the United States by a prominent and reputable publishing house. Shortly after the appearance in the United States of The Chief Culprit by Suvorov, the Canadian current affairs and military affairs analyst Eric Margolis wrote a column summarizing the findings of Viktor Suvorov and summarizing the conclusions of the book The Chief Culprit. He noted that Suvorov's basic argument is a simple one. Suvorov's basic point is that Stalin, in 1939, by agreeing to the non-aggression pact with Hitler, tricked Hitler by creating the conditions for a Soviet attack against Germany and against Europe. Stalin calculated that war then would take place between Germany on the one hand and Britain and France on the other, and that a destructive war between Germany on the one hand and Britain and France on the other hand would be ruinous for Europe and would set the stage for the Soviet Union then to go to war and pick up the pieces and take over all of Europe as a result. Now, Stalin knew, in fact, according to Suvorov, as Margolis summarizes, that Germany was no match militarily for the USSR. In fact, the Soviet military was built up by Stalin in 1938, 39, 40, and 41 into by far the largest military force in the world at the time. In 1941, Hitler had only a few thousand tanks, most of them light vehicles armed with machine guns or 20mm cannon. Now, the image of the German military forces in 1940-41 is of a mechanized, quick-striking military force that carries out blitzkrieg or lightning war. But in fact, 75%, three-quarters of German transport in 1941 was horse-drawn. And Eric Margolis notes that, tries and suggests, try to imagine how much hay and how many hay wagons are needed to feed 750,000 horses. When the German forces attacked in June 1941, they had no winter uniforms because the German High Command expected to win the war against Russia in just 3 months, that is, before winter set in. More importantly, Germany had no raw materials itself except coal. Its only source of oil was from Romania and from Russia. Germany only had enough oil for a 2-3 month campaign against the Soviet Union. It had no motor lubricants suitable for Russia's minus 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit winter weather. Now, as Margolis notes, Suvorov dug deeply into Soviet files, including Soviet military and intelligence files, and assembled an impressive amount of other evidence to show that in the spring of 1941, Stalin was poised to launch 170 divisions and 24,000 tanks and thousands of warplanes in a surprise attack against Germany and against Europe, supported by mountains of munitions and more reserve armies from Asia and the Far East. In this Soviet plan, the first target was going to be Romania and the Romanian oil fields, so that Germany's only source of oil would be cut off. Even Italy was dependent, of course, also along with Germany, on Romanian oil, so that a Soviet strike against the Ploest oil fields in Romania would have knocked out both Italy and Germany as sustainable military powers at war. The Red Army and Air Force were deployed in offensive formations very close to the new German-Soviet border. Stalin ordered all 1,000-plus defensive casements of the so-called Stalin line, the defensive line, stripped because he was preparing not for a defensive battle, but for an offense against Germany and Europe. But Hitler struck first. Learning of the Soviet threat, Hitler secretly massed his armies and attacked on the morning of June 22, 1941. The German attack, which had the codename Operation Barbarossa, was a tactical surprise. It caught the Russians flat-footed, and the Germans were able to destroy large numbers of Soviet warplanes on the ground, large amounts of munitions stored in the open, and Soviet ground forces were quickly enveloped, cut off, and destroyed in vast numbers. Had the Soviet forces been positioned in defensive deployments, especially behind the Stalin line, the German success would not, on this scale, simply would not have been possible. As Soviet propaganda ever since has tried to cover up Stalin's plans to attack Europe, claiming that his forces were outmoded and unprepared and his generals were incompetent. In fact, this view still prevails today. Not so, claims Suvorov. And Suvorov's view, as Margolis points out, was bound and has been infuriating to many mainstream historians. Commenting on what Suvorov writes, Margolis says this: I pored through Suvorov's meticulous military analysis. To me, as a veteran military analyst, his figures appear to confirm that Stalin was just about to attack when Hitler preempted him. By 1945, Stalin's Red Army had taken half of Europe. But, contends Suvorov, had Hitler not attacked first in 1941, Stalin's 30-million-man army, backed by mammoth industrial production, would have overwhelmed all of Europe in a 1941 surprise blitz attack. Suvorov's unstated conclusion is that Hitler, in fact, saved Western Europe, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, and so forth from Stalin. Suvorov asserts less convincingly that Hitler's offensive into Russia was, even though it was not successful, it was such a striking blow that it led inevitably to the downfall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and thus to the real end of World War II. In Suvorov's view, if Poland in 1939 had agreed to give the German-populated city of Danzig to Germany, war might have been avoided altogether. There would have been no war involving Britain and France and Germany, and the terrible, terrible conflict of World War II would have been avoided. Now, whether a conflict ultimately, of course, involving the Soviet Union and Germany could have been avoided is more difficult to say, but certainly it would have prevented Stalin's plans, as he envisioned them, for a conflict between Britain and France on the one hand and Germany that he could take advantage of to expand the Soviet Empire into all of Europe. Now, I'm going to take some time now to look at the general overall controversy involving Hitler's attack against the Soviet Union in 1941, and more specifically, the remarkable findings of Suvorov in his book Icebreaker. The biggest point that Suvorov makes in his book is to show that the enormous scale of the Soviet military buildup and the nature of the Soviet military buildup leaves no conclusion possible other than that Stalin was preparing to attack Germany and the rest of Europe in 1941. Now, he assembles tremendous amount of evidence, but his emphasis is on the sheer size of this military buildup. Even though Suvorov's book is the most important one to come out in the late 1980s in German and French editions, since his book appeared, his basic thesis has been fortified and strengthened by additional evidence found by other historians since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Since that time, many other Russian historians, including Mikhail Melchikov, Vladimir Nevazhin, Boris Sokolov, Valery Danilov, and others have accepted and have agreed with Suvorov's basic thesis. In addition, Suvorov's findings have been upheld by German historians, probably most prominently Joachim Hoffmann, who for years was with the Military History Research Office, an official German military center. One of the main pieces of evidence presented by not only Suvorov but by other historians in Germany and elsewhere before that is a very important speech given by Stalin in May 5th, 1941, and then 10 days later a plan for a Soviet offensive against Germany dated May 15th, 1941, drafted by Marshal Zhukov and prepared for Stalin. Stalin's speech of May 5th, 1941 has been very controversial, but one of the most interesting aspects of this speech is that the text of it has never been published. This already strongly suggests that the text of the speech has not been published because it cannot be squared with the official view of the Soviet government that the German attack was a surprise attack and that the Soviet Union was a peaceful government and that the Germans had treacherously surprised Stalin. In fact, the speech by Stalin on that date to Soviet officers, which was a closed audience, clearly shows that Stalin was announcing a great change in Soviet policy and preparing officers for an imminent Soviet attack against Germany and Western Europe. Other Russian historians have disagreed with this, but they have been unable to answer the most telling arguments and evidence presented by those historians who hold that the Soviet government and Stalin was preparing itself to attack Germany and Europe. Among those who accept that the Soviet Union was preparing to attack is the German historian Klaus Hildebrandt, and he laid out these arguments in an article that appeared in the prestigious German historical journal Historische Zeitschrift in 1987. And more or less the same position has been embraced by the Israeli military historian Martin van Crefeld. In an interview in 2005, he said this: "I doubt that Stalin wanted to attack as early as autumn 1941, as some writers argue, but I have no doubt that sooner or later, if Germany would have been entangled in a war with Great Britain and the U.S., he, that is Stalin, would have taken what he wanted. Judging by the talks between Ribbentrop and Molotov, that is the German and Soviet foreign ministers, in November 1940, this would have been Romania, Bulgaria, and access to the North Sea, the Dardanelles, that is in Turkey, and probably those parts of Poland that were under German control at the time." He adds that in 1941, the Red Army was the largest army in the world. Stalin may, as I have said, not have planned to attack Germany in autumn 1941, but it would be hard to believe that he would have not have taken the opportunity to stab the Reich in the back sometime. Now this is an Israeli historian who's saying this, who certainly has no reason or motive in exonerating, as it were, Hitler. Now, among the other historians, there's been some, even in the United States, that have taken the view that Stalin was preparing to attack, and that the German attack in June 1941 was a preventive strike. The plan drawn by Soviet General Georgy Zhukov and dated May 15th and signed by other high-ranking Soviet military forces states, and I'm quoting, "In view of the fact that Germany at present keeps its army fully mobilized with its rear services deployed, it has the capacity of deploying ahead of us and striking a sudden blow. To prevent this, I consider it important not to leave the operational initiative to the German command in any circumstances, but to anticipate the enemy and attack the German army at the moment when it is in the process of deploying and before it has time to organize its front and the coordination of its various arms." Well, we'll take a break at this point, and hello and welcome back. In this broadcast, as I've been explaining, I'm going into the background to the German attack against the Soviet Union in June 1941 and the tremendous discussion that new evidence that's been presented about this has set off among historians, especially in Russia and in Western Europe, but far less here in the United States. And I was speaking specifically when we went on break about the plan, which only became known after the fall of the Soviet Union, drawn up by Soviet General Georgy Zhukov for Stalin, dated May 15, 1941, of a Soviet attack and strike against Europe that would begin with a capture of the Romanian oil fields, which would basically render Germany inevitably unable to pursue a war for very long. One of the most detailed presentations by a German historian on all of this is by the German historian Joachim Hoffmann in his book Stalin's War of Extermination, which I'm going to quote from in more detail in a few minutes. Now, as I said, the most important book to really open up the discussion about all of this is the book by Viktor Suvorov entitled Icebreaker. Now, although this book is not readily available in English, the essence of what is in that book is available in English in the book published under the title The Chief Culprit, published in 2008 by the U.S. Naval Institute Press. A review of the book Icebreaker by Suvorov was published by the Institute for Historical Review and written by Joseph Bishop, who contributed a number of very valuable reviews and essays for the Institute of Historical Review's Journal of Historical Review. I'm very proud that over the years, a number of articles of very good quality have been published by the IHR, written by Joseph Bishop and also by retired Defense Department writer Daniel Michaels. Now, in the review of Icebreaker by Joseph Bishop, he writes this: according to the conventional view, Hitler's perfidious attack abruptly forced a neutral and aloof Soviet Russia into war. This view further holds that a surprised Stalin had naively trusted the deceitful German Führer. Rejecting this view as political propaganda, Suvorov shows Stalin's personal responsibility for the war's outbreak and progression. Above all, this book details the vast Soviet preparations for an invasion of Europe in the summer of 1941 with the goal of Sovietizing Central and Western Europe. Suvorov is not alone in his view. It is also affirmed by a number of non-Russian historians, such as American scholar R.H.S. Stolfi in his 1991 study, Hitler's Panzers East. Suvorov points out that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was not a normal state or country in the Western or generally accepted sense of the word. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was ultimately meant to be, by Lenin, by Stalin, and by other Soviet leaders, to be a world union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That would include not merely Russia and Ukraine and the Baltic states, but ultimately all the states of the world. Ultimately, there would be a union of Soviet Socialist Republics that would embrace the entire globe. One person who understood this better than any of the other major non-Soviet leaders during the 1930s and 40s was Hitler, because Germany and Central Europe had experienced firsthand Soviet efforts to impose Soviet control and Soviet rule in a way that Americans or Britain or the French had not. The symbol of the Soviet Union, the official seal of the Soviet Union, Suvorov points out, was a hammer and sickle imposed over the entire globe. And consistent with that, Stalin was constantly mindful of the importance of extending the Soviet Union as much as possible. Lenin and Stalin were both very mindful that the First World War had brought Soviet rule to Russia, and that, in their view, a Second World War would bring Soviet rule to all of Europe and hopefully later to the rest of the world. During a conversation in 1937 with Lord Halifax, who was one of Britain's most important officials, Hitler emphasized, quote, "In the event of a general war in Europe, only one country can win. That country is the Soviet Union." Hitler was constantly eager to avoid at all costs any war with Britain or France, contrary, of course, to the popular American view propagated by American President Franklin Roosevelt and by many other American leaders. It wasn't it wasn't Germany that declared war on or sought war against Britain or France. It was Britain and France in 1939 that declared war against Germany on the basis of a supposed concern that Polish independence had been violated, even though Britain and France was in no position to offer any concrete or substantive help to Poland, and also given that the Britain and French governments did not declare war against the Soviet Union when Soviet forces invaded Poland in 1939, and at the end of the war did nothing to prevent the Soviet takeover of Poland in 1944-45, even though it was Polish independence that was the pretext for the British and French declarations of war in 1939. What Stalin anticipated when he made the non-aggression treaty with Germany in 1939 was a drawn-out war of attrition in which Germany, France, and Britain would exhaust themselves in a devastating conflict that would also spark or at least set the stage for communist uprisings across Europe. As the Soviet premier expected, Germany would be a kind of icebreaker that would break up the established order in Europe. But along with nearly everyone else in the world, Stalin was astonished by the speed and thoroughness with which German forces subdued not only Poland, but also France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The Kremlin and Stalin expected that the Soviet Europe would be ushered in quickly when Britain and France and Germany would exhaust themselves. But instead, by July 1940, Hitler was effectively master of the continent. And what that did was move Stalin to speed up his preparations for a war of aggression, an offensive strike, building up in preparation for that a huge Soviet military. In 1939, Germany entered the war with just 3,195 tanks. As Suvorov points out, this was fewer than the number of tanks produced every 6 months by a single Soviet factory in Kharkov. By 1941, the Soviet military was by far the largest military in the world. The Soviet Air Force was not only the largest in the world in 1941, it was larger than the air forces of the rest of the world put together. Suvorov emphasizes the scale of the Soviet paratroop force and emphasizes that paratroops are not used in defensive operations, but exclusively in offensive, aggressive military campaigns. Well, Germany had an airborne assault units in 1939, and in 1939 they had 4,000 German paratroops. But at the beginning of the war, 1939, the Soviet Union had more than 1 million trained paratroopers, 200 times more than all other countries in the world put together, including Germany. Suvorov goes on to write, "It is quite impossible to use paratroopers in such massive numbers in a defensive war. No country in history, or indeed all countries in the world put together, including the Soviet Union, has ever had so many paratroops and air assault landing subunits as Stalin had in 1941. Again, Suvorov emphasized, the sheer enormous scale of the Soviet paratroop force in 1941 can only be explained in the context as part of the Soviet effort and plan to attack Europe in 1941. He also quotes a secret meeting in December 1940 attended by Stalin and other high-level Politburo members, at which a Soviet general and deputy defense minister and commander of the Soviet Air Force discussed details of what's called a special operations in the initial period of war. And he spoke of the necessity of keeping the Soviet Air Force's preparations secret in order to, and I'm quoting, to catch the whole of the enemy Air Force on the ground. Suvorov comments, "It is quite obvious that it is not possible to, quote, catch the whole of the enemy Air Force on the ground in time of war. It is only possible to do so in peacetime when the enemy does not suspect the danger. Stalin created so many airborne troops that they could be used only in one situation, after a surprise attack by the Soviet Air Force on the airfields of the enemy. It would be simply impossible to use hundreds of thousands of airborne troops and thousands of transport aircraft and gliders in any other situation." Suvorov also quotes the statement by the German General Wilhelm Keitel, who is, as I mentioned, chief of German Armed Forces High Command, in a post-war interrogation. Keitel said in 1945, quote, "All the preparatory measures we took before spring 1941, that is German military measures, were defensive measures against the contingency of a possible attack by the Red Army. Thus the entire war in the East, to a known degree, may be termed a preventive war. We decided to forestall an attack by Soviet Russia and to destroy its armed forces with a surprise attack. By spring of 1941, I had formed a definite opinion that the heavy buildup of Russian troops and their attack on Germany which would follow would place us, in both economic and strategic terms, in an exceptionally critical situation. Our attack, that is the German attack, was the immediate consequence of this threat." Suvorov also quotes the memoirs of the Soviet Admiral Kuznetsov, Soviet Navy minister, who was also a member of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party. In his memoir, published in 1966, he recalled, quote, "For me there is one thing beyond all argument. J.V. Stalin not only did not exclude the possibility of war with Hitler's Germany, on the contrary, he considered such a war inevitable. Stalin made preparations for war, wide and varied preparations, beginning on dates which he himself had selected. Hitler upset his calculations." Suvorov comments, "The Admiral is telling us quite clearly and openly that Stalin considered war inevitable and prepared himself seriously to enter it at a time of his own choosing. In other words, Stalin was preparing to strike the first blow, that is, to commit aggression against Germany. But Hitler dealt a preventive blow first and thereby frustrated all Stalin's plans." Now, Suvorov goes on to point out, Hitler's assault was not fatal against the Soviet Union because it came too late to be successful. He writes, "Even the Wehrmacht's surprise attack on the Soviet Union could no longer save Hitler and his empire. Hitler understood where the greatest danger was coming from, but it was already too late." With great efforts, the Soviets were able to recover from the shattering blow, and Stalin succeeded in forming new armies to replace those lost in the second half of 1941. Suvorov also emphasizes, as does many other historians, that the United States, immediately upon the outbreak of the German attack against the Soviet Union, immediately began giving military aid to Soviet Russia. Another historian who has dealt with this entire subject is the German historian, now dead, Adolf von Taden, who wrote a book entitled Stalin's Trap, which appeared in 1996 in German. The review of this book appeared, published by the IHR and written by Daniel Michaels. Michaels comments, "For decades, the prevailing and more or less official view in the United States and Europe has been that a race-crazed Adolf Hitler, without warning or provocation, betrayed a trusting Joseph Stalin by launching a treacherous surprise attack against the totally unprepared Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Von Taden's book, which is based in large part on recently uncovered evidence from Russian archives, Stalin's own statements, and new revelations of Russian military specialists, persuasively debunks this view. Many Soviet documents captured by the Germans during the course of the war, as well as German intelligence reports on the Soviet buildup in 1941, amply justify Hitler's decision to strike." He goes on to quote a speech by Hitler in December 11, 1941, a speech available on the IHR website, in fact, which I myself translated from German into English. Hitler himself explained the German attack against the Soviet Union with these words: "Already in 1940 it was becoming increasingly clear from month to month that the plans of the men in the Kremlin were aimed at the domination and thus the destruction of all of Europe. I have already told the nation of the buildup of Soviet military power in the East during a period when Germany had only a few divisions in the provinces bordering Soviet Russia. Only a blind person could fail to see that a military buildup of unique world historical dimensions was being carried out, and this was not in order to protect something that was being threatened, but rather only to attack that which seemed incapable of defense. When I became aware of the possibility of a threat to the east of the Reich in 1940, through secret reports from the British House of Commons and by observations of Soviet-Russian troop movements on our frontiers, I immediately ordered the formation of many new armored, motorized, and infantry divisions." Hitler goes on, "We realized very clearly that under no circumstances could we allow the enemy the opportunity to strike first into our rear. Nevertheless, the decision in this case was a very difficult one. A truly impressive amount of authentic material," Hitler went on, "is now available that confirms that a Soviet-Russian attack was intended. We are also sure about when this attack was to take place. In view of this danger, the extent of which we are perhaps only now truly aware, I can only thank the Lord God that He enlightened me in time and has given me the strength to do what must be done. Millions of German soldiers may thank Him for their lives, and all of Europe for its existence. I may say this today, if the wave of more than 20,000 tanks, hundreds of divisions, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, along with more than 10,000 airplanes, had not been kept from being set into motion against the Reich, Europe would have been lost." Von Taden in his book also quotes a statement by General Alfred Jodl, who, as I mentioned, was chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, who emphasizes that the German attack was a purely preventive war. What we found out later on was the certainty of enormous Russian military preparations opposite our frontier. I will dispense with details, Jodl went on, but I can only say that although we succeeded in a tactical surprise as to the day and the hour, it was no strategic surprise. Russia was fully prepared for war. One of the Of course, the ultimate consequence of the conflict was that Germany lost the war in spite of having the tremendous advantage of striking first in June 1941. Why did Germany therefore lose? Hitler himself explained on a number of occasions, both privately and in public, that he had miscalculated, had underestimated the enormity of the Soviet military force that had been built up. There were far more Soviet divisions than even German intelligence had estimated. And Hitler, along with all other German generals, were simply astonished at the sheer enormity and scope of the Soviet military preparations for an attack against Germany and against Western Europe. For example, in a conference that Hitler had with the Finnish general Gustav Mannerheim in 1942, Hitler said confidentially in this meeting that if a German general had told him in late 1940 or early 1941 of the how many Soviet tanks there were, he would have thought that the German general was crazy, was out of his mind to think there could be this many Soviet tanks. Von Totten also points out that even some open Soviet forces have acknowledged the preparations for a surprise attack. In 1991, in the issue of May 8th, the influential Moscow daily Pravda, which of course was an official Soviet newspaper, told readers, and I'm quoting, "Unrealistic Soviet plans of an offensive nature were drawn up before the war as a result of an overestimation of our own capabilities and an underestimation of the enemy's. In accordance with these plans, we, that is the Soviets, began deploying our forces on the western frontier, but the enemy beat us to it." Another piece of evidence that has come to light only recently, that is only in the last several years, confirming Soviet intentions to attack Europe, was found in the American National Archives by an Israeli historian named Misha Shauli. This had been published years earlier but had been neglected, but this was found and confirmed by him. This was a document from 1939 that reflects and reports on a dialogue, on a conference in Moscow between a delegation of Czech communists and a senior Soviet foreign ministry official. The Czech communists were very worried and wanted an explanation of why the USSR had signed a non-aggression treaty with Nazi Germany, that is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. The Soviet official explained that the Soviet Union signed this agreement, that if the Soviets had signed an agreement with the West, Hitler would not have dared to launch a war. But without it, there would have been no possibility of imposing communism on Europe, and that the Soviets had done this to buy time in preparation for an attack. Now, again, if all of this evidence is as compelling as I think I've laid out today, this forces a rewriting of World War II. At a very minimum, it means that the simplistic portrayal of World War II as a conflict between the good U.S. and its allies and the bad Germans is entirely inaccurate, and means that the history of World War II must be drastically rewritten. And that is an important job for historians still to be carried out effectively, above all, here in the United States.